The emergency ward was already overloaded before the sirens came. Then the glass doors exploded open, paramedics shouting, blood on the floor, a stretcher sliding too fast to control. A man in tactical gear was brought in. Not a soldier, not a civilian, something in between. Unconscious but still armed. Security tried to take the weapon. He woke up for half a second, and in that half second, everyone in the room froze, except the quiet nurse at the far end of the ward. She didn't run, she didn't speak. She just slowly pulled on a pair of gloves and looked toward the sealed trauma room like she had already seen this moment before. No one noticed it yet, but the entire situation had just changed direction, and whatever was coming next was not hospital protocol anymore. The night shift began like every other night. Fluorescent lights hummed softly over the emergency ward, steady and indifferent, as if nothing inside these walls ever truly changed. Outside, the city was restless. Inside, everything was controlled routine. Monitor beeps, distant footsteps, the low murmur of tired conversations. The nurse stood at the supply counter, checking inventory sheets without hurry. Her uniform was clean, her posture relaxed. Nothing about her suggested urgency. Nothing about her asked to be noticed. Patients arrived in slow waves. A child with fever. An old man struggling to breathe. A minor road accident that had already been stabilized before reaching the hospital. The kind of night where everything stayed just on the edge of manageable. The other staff moved around her, speaking in half sentences, adjusting drips, updating charts. They didn't look at her unless they had to. Not out of disrespect, just habit. She blended into the background the way quiet people often do in busy places. Room 4 needs saline replacement. She nodded once and moved without replying. Her steps were measured, not rushed, not hesitant, just precise. A junior doctor passed her in the corridor, barely glancing up from his file. "We're stable so far," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. She didn't respond. She was already observing the monitors through the glass wall. Heart rates, oxygen levels, timing, small patterns most people ignored. At the far end of the ward, a security guard leaned back in his chair, bored. He checked his phone. The night felt uneventful enough for distraction. That was usually when things went wrong, but nothing suggested it yet. The nurse entered the medication room. The door clicked softly behind her. Inside, it was quieter. Only the faint refrigeration hum and the smell of sterilized equipment. She prepared a tray. Siring is aligned. Labels checked twice. Movements efficient but never hurried. On the surface, she was exactly what she appeared to be. A competent hospital worker doing her job, but her eyes lingered a fraction longer on certain details. The way a trauma kit had been restocked, incorrectly. The way one emergency stretcher had a missing restraint strap. The way the night shift roster had an unusual gap in security coverage near the ambulance entry point. None of it meant anything alone. Together, it formed a pattern. She paused for half a second longer than necessary, then continued. In the hallway outside, laughter broke briefly from the nurse's station. Someone shared a story from earlier in the day. A moment of relief. Human, normal. She did not interrupt it. She simply passed behind them, quiet as a shadow moving through light. At 02:17, the ambulance radio crackled faintly in the distance. No one paid attention. Ambulances came and went all night. The nurse stopped near the central desk and glanced toward the entrance doors. For a moment, she didn't move. Then she adjusted her gloves, slowly, methodically. Not because anything had changed, but because something was about to. A stretcher rolled in from trauma bay preparation. A patient with blunt injuries, unconscious, stabilized en route. The attending paramedic gave a short report. Routine language. Routine urgency. Motor vehicle incident. Possible internal bleeding. "No ID confirmed yet," the doctor responded quickly. "Prepare CT scan and trauma assessment." The ward shifted into standard response mode, but the nurse's gaze stayed fixed a little longer than normal on the patient's gear bag, military grade. Stitching, non-standard fastening. Weight, distribution inconsistent with civilian equipment. She said nothing. The stretcher moved past her. For a brief moment, the hospital lights flickered, barely noticeable. just enough to make reflections shift on metal surfaces. She turned slightly toward the corridor again. Her expression did not change, but her focus had sharpened. Outside, somewhere beyond the hospital walls, a distant siren began to rise, still far, still uncertain. No one in the ward reacted, not yet. The nurse placed her tray down at the station, adjusted a single file on the counter, and looked once more toward the entry corridor. Calm, controlled, waiting as if she already understood that the night had just stopped being ordinary and something was about to enter this hospital that did not belong to it. The ambulance doors opened again before the ward had fully settled. This time, the sound was different, not routine, harsher, urgent. Controlled panic held together by training. 2 paramedics moved in fast, not speaking more than necessary. The way a stretcher rolled with uneven weight distribution, wheels clicking slightly off rhythm against the floor. Trauma incoming, unconscious male, severe blunt force injury, possible combat-related impact. The attending nurse at the desk looked up immediately. Combat-related? She repeated, unsure if she heard correctly. No one answered directly. The stretcher passed under the lights. That was when the room changed. The patient was wearing tactical underlayers beneath torn civilian clothing. Not standard, not accidental. The fabric was reinforced in places most hospitals never saw. Small. Signs of equipment removal were visible, straps cut cleanly, not torn. A doctor leaned in. He military? One paramedic hesitated. We don't have clearance to confirm. That hesitation said more than the answer. The patient's vitals were unstable but controlled. Too controlled for the level of trauma visible. Whoever had stabilized him before arrival knew advanced field protocols. The nurse stood near the medication station, observing without stepping forward. Her eyes tracked the patient's hands. One finger twitched slightly. Not random. Reflex recovery. She noted it silently. The stretcher was pushed into Trauma Bay 2. The door slid shut behind it. For a moment, the ward returned to its normal rhythm, but only on the surface. Inside Trauma Bay 2, the atmosphere shifted immediately into controlled urgency. Monitors were attached, IV lines prepared. A nurse called out readings, a doctor ordered scans. Prepare full imaging, chest, spine, cranial. Blood pressure dropping slightly but stabilizing. The team worked quickly, yet something felt off. The patient's condition didn't match the equipment he carried, and more importantly, it didn't match how he survived. In the corridor, the nurse adjusted her gloves again. Not rushed, not nervous, just precise. A junior nurse passed by and whispered, "Weird case, right?" The protagonist didn't answer immediately. Then calmly, "Not standard trauma." The junior nurse blinked. "What do you mean?" But she was already walking away. Inside Trauma Bay 2, a sudden spike on the monitor caused a brief alarm. Heart rate spiking. Check sedation level. The door opened briefly as a doctor called for additional supplies. That was when the patient's eyes opened, just for a fraction of a second. Enough. The gaze was not confused, not weak. It scanned the room with instinctive calculation, then locked onto something outside the room. The door. Security outside shifted instinctively. The patient's hand moved slightly, not toward panic, toward control. Then, he went still again. But the ward had already registered the change. A security guard at the end of the corridor stood upright now, alert, uncertain why. The nurse at the counter noticed him. Then she looked toward Trauma Bay 2 again. Her expression remained unchanged, but her attention had fully shifted, because she recognized something the others hadn't yet understood. This wasn't just a trauma case. It was a controlled asset under breakdown conditions, and something had followed him here. A distant sound came through the hospital intercom system, static, then silence. The lights flickered once more, longer this time, not enough to alarm most staff, but enough for those paying attention. The nurse slowly placed a file down on the counter, and for the first time that night, she did not move immediately after. She was listening, not to the hospital, but to what the hospital had just unknowingly brought inside its walls. The shift in atmosphere did not announce itself loudly. It tightened, like a door slowly being sealed from the outside. At 0241, the hospital security radio crackled again, this time sharper. More urgent, unverified armed movement reported within 3 blocks. Repeat, possible armed approach toward medical facility. The words reached the ward in fragments. Most staff heard them without fully processing. The nurse did. She looked up. Immediately, not fast, not surprised, just aware. The head nurse at the station frowned. Is this confirmed? No answer came right away. That silence was the answer. Within minutes, the hospital protocol changed. Doors that were usually left open between wings were locked. Security guards repositioned themselves toward entry points. Non-essential. Movement in corridors was reduced. The environment that had been routine just minutes. Ego now felt segmented, controlled, restricted containment behavior. The nurse moved through it without hesitation. She checked room 4, then room 6, then returned toward the central station. Her actions looked unchanged. Routine tasks still performed, but her attention was no longer on patients alone. It was on exits, on blind spots, on overlapping camera coverage. A junior doctor approached her in the corridor. They're locking down sections. Probably precautionary, she nodded once. It's not just precaution, he hesitated. What do you mean? She didn't answer immediately. Then, they don't lock hospitals for rumors. She walked past him before he could respond. At 0253, the first external security confirmation arrived. A radio message cut through the ward system. Hospital perimeter advised. 2 unidentified vehicles approaching from East Access Road. No clearance granted. The tone changed everything. Now, it was real. Now, it was inside decision distance. Security moved faster. Lock. Mechanisms engaged at secondary entrances. The ambulance bay doors were reinforced, but systems were not designed for coordination under pressure. They were designed for procedures, and procedures always lag behind intent. The nurse stopped near the glass corridor that overlooked Trauma Bay 2 inside. The tactical patient was still under observation, still unstable, still silent, but no longer the only variable in the system. She noticed something else now. The staff's movement patterns were changing, uncoordinated, reactive. Fear begins to restructure space. That was always the first breakdown. Loud metallic click echoed from the lower corridor. Everyone in the ward turned instinctively. Security. Check their radios. Check that sound, one guard said. No response came immediately, then another. Sound closer, not random, measured, like someone testing access points. The nurse's eyes shifted slightly toward the corridor leading to the ambulance entry. Her posture remained unchanged, but her focus narrowed. At 0301, the overhead system triggered full alert status. Code lock. Secure all non-essential access points. Doors sealed with mechanical precision. Staff froze briefly, then moved quickly to assigned positions. The hospital was no longer open space. It was compartmentalized structure, and something was moving through its edges. From inside Trauma Bay 2, a sudden spike of movement registered on the monitor. The patient's hand twitched again, this time stronger. A nurse stepped forward. Sedation might be wearing off, the doctor responded sharply. Increased dosage. But before they could act, the monitor flickered once, twice, then stabilized again, too fast, too controlled. The nurse in the corridor noticed it instantly. That wasn't equipment failure. That was interference timing. She turned slightly toward the glass. Outside, through the far end of the corridor, a shadow moved briefly past a reinforced door window, then disappeared. Security shouted something over the radio, unclear, distorted, and then a distant impact sound echoed through the lower floor. Not an explosion, not loud enough, but deliberate. Breach test. The hospital didn't know it yet, but someone outside was mapping its response time, and someone inside was already preparing to compensate. The nurse adjusted her gloves. Again, this time slower. Not routine anymore, intentional. Because. Now the hospital was no longer just a place of treatment. It had become a controlled entry point, and the control was starting to slip. The first impact was not on a door, it was on timing. At 03:08, the ambulance bay access panel flashed red for less than a second before the backup system engaged. Too fast for most to notice, but long enough to signal something had tried and nearly succeeded. Then the real breach began. A second sound followed, heavier, controlled, not random force, but repeated pressure against a reinforced service entrance on the lower. Level security responded instantly. Lower corridor. Check. Now. 2 guards moved down the stairwell. Their radios stayed open for 8 seconds. Only footsteps were heard. Then a pause. Then static. The connection did not fully drop. It fractured. Inside the emergency ward, staff froze at their stations. Not panic yet, but recognition of escalation. The kind that turns routine training into uncertain memory. The nurse at the central corridor did not move with them. She stayed slightly back from the crowd flow, eyes fixed on the layout of the hospital structure through the glass panels. The system was no longer just reacting. It was being probed. A doctor rushed past her. "They're trying to break in downstairs," she replied calmly. "They're testing response routes." He looked at her. "What?" But she had already turned away. At 03:12, the lower corridor door alarm triggered, not fully breached, compromised. Security shouted through the radio, voice strained. "We've got forced entry attempt. Repeat, forced entry attempt at service corridor." Then, a short burst of interference. The signal cracked, silence for half a second, then resumed. But something had changed in that silence. Now everyone knew it was not a rumor. It was coordinated. On the upper floor, Trauma Bay 2 remained sealed, but the patient's condition was no longer the primary focus. Movement outside the room increased. Nurses repositioned equipment carts as barriers. A junior staff member whispered, "Should we evacuate non-critical patients?" No one answered immediately, because evacuation implies exit, and exits were now being evaluated from both sides. The nurse moved for the first time, toward the corridor intersection between the ER and the ambulance bay line, not fast, not urgent, controlled. She stopped where she could see 3 directions at once: Corridor A, emergency intake corridor; B, trauma bay access corridor; security stairwell. Her eyes shifted once across each path, then she paused. Subtle change in sound reached her. Footsteps, not. Hospital rhythm, too consistent, too disciplined. Security radio came through. Again, "We've got unidentified movement at ground access, possibly armed. Do not engage alone." That phrase changed posture across the ward. Do not engage alone, meaning engagement was expected. The nurse exhaled slowly, still no change in expression. But something in her stance adjusted, barely visible. Wait. Distribution shifted slightly, awareness expanded outward. At 03:18, the hospital lights dimmed for less than a second. Emergency backup engaged automatically. During that momentary dip, movement appeared at the far end of the lower corridor window. A silhouette, then another, then gone. But it was enough. Security shouted, "Contact visual!" The response was immediate but fragmented. Too many entry points, too few coordinated positions, and inside the ER, civilians began to understand what staff already feared. This was not a single intruder. It was a mapped entry. The nurse stepped closer to the intersection glass. Through reflection, she saw the lower corridor door again. This time, pressure increased, metal strained, not breaking yet, but preparing. A junior nurse approached her, voice low. "What do we do?" A pause, then the reply, calm. "We keep the inside stable, that was all. No panic, no expansion, just containment thinking." At 03:22, the breach escalated. The lower corridor door gave a final mechanical groan. Not explosion, not collapse, a controlled failure. The seal broke. Security shouted again. Entry confirmed. Footsteps entered the hospital structure. Real. Now inside. Not outside threat anymore. Inside. System problem. And at that exact moment, Trauma Bay 2. Monitor spiked again, the tactical. Patient's vitals surged sharply, eyes opening fully this time. No. Confusion, immediate recognition, and the first movement of his hand was toward the restraint strap. Not resistance, assessment. The hospital had just shifted from containment state to engagement state. And the nurse, still at the intersection, quietly turned her head toward the sound of the breach, as if she had been waiting for it to finally become real. The moment the breach entered the hospital structure, everything inside shifted from reaction to positioning. Not chaos yet, something more controlled and more dangerous. At 03:23, the lower corridor lights flickered once again, this time briefly syncing with the movement of footsteps below. The pattern was no longer random. It was deliberate spacing, measured intervals, testing how the hospital responded to pressure points. Security tried to regroup, but their coordination was already strained. 2 confirmed hostiles inside lower service corridor, moving toward stairwell access. Repeat, do not isolate. Maintain visual contact. The radio traffic overlapped, each message slightly delayed, creating confusion in timing. Inside the emergency ward, staff began pulling non-critical patients deeper into protected rooms. Curtains were drawn, doors were locked. Equipment carts were repositioned without clear instruction. The system was still functioning, but it was no longer unified. And in that fragmentation, the nurse remained steady. She did not rush. She did not cluster with the others. Instead, she moved slowly toward the central glass corridor again, where visibility covered multiple intersecting pathways. Her eyes tracked movement patterns, not people yet, but structure, entry angles, blind intersections, camera coverage gaps. She wasn't watching the breach itself. She was watching how the hospital would fail under it. A junior doctor passed behind her, breathing faster than before. We need to get staff out of the ER wing if they push upstairs. Her answer came without turning. If they reach here, evacuation routes are already compromised. He froze slightly. How do you know that? She finally looked at him. Not sharply, not emotionally, just direct. Because they are not moving randomly. That ended the conversation. At 03:27, the first physical confrontation occurred downstairs, not visible from the ER but heard. A sudden crash echoed through the stairwell access point, followed by shouting. Then a sharp break in radio transmission. Security tried to respond. Engage, hold position, then static. The line cut for 2 seconds. When it returned, the voice was different, strained. We've lost lower stair control. That phrase changed everything. Loss of stair control meant vertical access, vulnerability, which meant the upper ward was now exposed. Inside, Trauma Bay 2, monitors spiked again. The tactical patient's eyes were fully open now. No confusion. No delay. Just awareness returning in fragments. A nurse stepped forward cautiously. He's regaining consciousness. The doctor nodded quickly. Maintain sedation. But the patient's hand moved first, not toward staff, toward the edge of the bed frame, testing restraint, measuring resistance. The nurse in the corridor noticed it immediately. Through the glass reflection, her gaze tightened slightly, but her posture remained unchanged. She was no longer just observing the hospital. She was now mapping both threats, simultaneously. Inside breach movement, inside, patient instability, 2 independent systems, collapsing in parallel and both converging toward the same, physical space. At 03:31, a new sound entered the ER corridor. Footsteps, closer than before, measured, not running. Security shouted from below, "They're advancing through stairwell access." Then a second voice, uncertain, "We're falling back." The nurse shifted her position by half a step. Small, almost, invisible, but it aligned her. Sightline with the ER entrance corridor and trauma. Bay 2 exit door simultaneously. She was no longer stationary. She was positioned. A senior doctor noticed her now. "We need full lockdown of this wing," she responded softly. "It is already locked." He frowned. Then why, but he stopped mid-sentence because he realized what she meant. Locked doors do not mean controlled space. They only mean contained space. At 03:34, a shadow passed briefly at the end of the ER corridor. No entry yet. Just presence. Testing visibility. Testing response delay. Inside Trauma Bay 2, the patient's breathing changed rhythm. Not. Worse. Controlled intentional, like someone returning to operational awareness under incomplete conditions. A faint sound came from inside the room, not speech. A coded exhale pattern. The doctor didn't recognize it, but the nurse, watching from the corridor, did not react outwardly. Only her eyes narrowed slightly. Recognition without confirmation. At that exact moment, security radio transmitted again, broken but urgent. Multiple hostiles confirmed inside structure, moving in coordinated formation. Coordinated. That word changed interpretation. This was not intrusion, it was insertion, and the hospital was now inside their operational map. The nurse slowly lowered her gaze toward the corridor junction again. Her hands were still, her breathing unchanged, but her attention had fully locked onto the next transition point because the situation was no longer about preventing entry. It was about controlling what happened after entry had already succeeded. And in that space between failure and response, she was no longer just observing, she was calculating. At 0336, the hospital stopped behaving like a single system. It split into fragments. Downstairs, security lines broke into scattered resistance. Upstairs, the ER wing became a contained pressure zone with too many unknowns inside it, and between them, the hospital's structure turned into a corridor of uncertainty. A loud impact echoed through the stairwell core. Then another, this time closer, metal against metal, controlled force. Not panic-driven damage. The attackers were not rushing. They were advancing with awareness of layout and response timing. That detail alone changed how the senior staff reacted. Protect the ER corridor. Do not allow vertical access overlap. But instructions were already lagging behind movement. In the emergency ward, patients were pulled deeper into secondary rooms. Curtains drawn tight. Monitors shifted. Equipment stacked to block visibility. Fear was no longer individual. It had become procedural. The nurse stood near the intersection glass again. Still calm. Still precise. But now completely anchored in observation. She tracked 3 things at once. Lower stairwell pressure ER corridor. Exposure Trauma Bay 2 internal stability. Each system was converging toward instability. Junior nurse approached her again, voice tight. We can't hold both wings if they push simultaneously. The response was immediate, quiet. Then they are not pushing simultaneously. The junior nurse blinked. What? But the nurse was already looking away because she had noticed the timing gap. The movements were staggered, not chaotic. Coordinated. Separation. One group forcing lower response, another probing upper. Corridor delay. A third unknown present still. Unconfirmed. This was not a breach, it was a structured overload. At 0341, the lower corridor security line collapsed completely. Radio transmission came through fragmented. We are fallback, repeat. Falling back, then silence. A guard ran into the ER corridor seconds later. Breath uneven, face pale, their inside stairwell access. We lost containment. That phrase rippled through the ward faster than alarms. Lost containment, meaning the structure itself was now compromised. Inside Trauma Bay 2, monitors spiked sharply again. The tactical patient's vitals stabilized abruptly. Too abruptly. Not natural recovery. Controlled regulation. The doctor leaned in. That's impossible. He shouldn't be stabilizing. Like this under sedation, but the nurse at the corridor glass already knew. Something had changed. The patient was no longer purely reactive. He was transitioning, not recovery. Reorientation. The hospital lights flickered again. Longer this time. Backup. Systems engaged with a soft mechanical hum, and in that brief shift of lighting, movement appeared at the ER entrance corridor, not fully visible, but confirmed by reflection. A figure, then another. Security shouted, "Contact upper corridor, visual confirmed." At the same moment, a loud impact hit the ER side door. Not breach yet. Testing pressure, measuring response. Inside, staff moved instinctively backward. Patients were pulled further away from windows. The nurse did not retreat. She shifted one step forward, not toward danger, toward alignment. Her position now covered direct sight lines to both trauma, Bay 2, and ER entrance corridor, a senior doctor noticed. "You need to move to safety," she answered without looking at him. Safety is already compromised. At 03:45, the ER corridor door, reinforcement groaned under pressure. Security tried to stabilize position, but radio interference increased again. Communication delays widened. 2 seconds, then 3, then inconsistent return. Inside Trauma Bay 2, the patient suddenly turned, his head slightly toward the door, not randomly, accurately, as if listening to something outside the room. His hand tightened briefly on the restraint. Not struggle assessment. And in that moment, the nurse in the corridor noticed something subtle. The pattern of movement from downstairs had stopped. Not withdrawal, coordination, shift, repositioning. They were not retreating. They were preparing vertical synchronization. That realization changed the entire structure of the moment because it meant the next phase was not entry, it was convergence. At 03:47, both stairwell and ER corridor pressure increased. Simultaneously, a synchronized push. The hospital structure groaned under combined stress. Points. Security shouted orders. Staff moved instinctively. But everything now was reactive, no longer predictive. And in the center of it all, the nurse remained still, watching timing, not fear, not chaos timing, because she had already understood what the others had not fully processed. Yet the hospital was no longer defending against intrusion. It was being measured for control takeover, and the next failure point was about to open. At 03:49, the hospital stopped feeling like a building and started feeling like a trap with moving parts. The ER corridor doorframe was now under sustained pressure. Not enough to break instantly, but enough to ensure fatigue. Each impact landed at measured intervals, like someone counting the resistance rather than forcing it. Downstairs, the stairwell had gone quiet again. That silence was worse than the noise, because it meant repositioning. The nurse stood at the intersection glass, her posture unchanged, but her attention fully narrowed now. Everything had converged to this wing. ER corridor access Trauma Bay 2 central intersection. 3 points. 1 outcome. A senior doctor rushed past her again. "We need to evacuate this entire wing now. We can still move patients through the west corridor." She didn't respond immediately. Then quietly, "West corridor is already compromised." He stopped. "That's not confirmed." She finally turned her head slightly toward him. "Not fully, just enough. It doesn't need to be confirmed to be used." That answer stayed with him longer than the sound of alarms. At 03:52, a new impact hit the ER door, stronger than before. The frame bent slightly inward. Security fired a warning over radio, voice breaking under pressure. "They're breaching upper access now. Repeat, upper access breach imminent." Inside Trauma Bay 2, the tactical patient suddenly shifted again, this time more clearly, eyes fully open, breathing steady, awareness fully returned. A nurse stepped back instinctively. "He's awake!" The doctor moved quickly. "Maintain restraint, keep him stable." But the patient didn't resist. He assessed the room, the staff, the timing outside. Then he spoke for the first time. One word. Not. Loud, controlled, coordination. The room went still for half a second. No one answered him, because no one fully understood what that meant in context, except the nurse in the corridor. Her expression did not change, but something inside her. Posture aligned differently. At 03:54, the ER corridor door failed its third pressure cycle. Metal frame cracked, not fully open, but structurally compromised. Security shouted, "We cannot hold the line!" Panic started to surface in fragments across the ward, but panic does not operate evenly. It spreads unevenly, and the nurse moved for the first time with visible intent. She stepped away from the glass, toward the central equipment station. Not running, not rushing, just decisive. A junior nurse followed her gaze. "Where are you going?" Her answer was calm. To stabilize access. The junior nurse frowned. You can't, security is... But she had already taken something from the station. Not a weapon. Not visible authority. Something simpler. Control tools, access keys, override credentials. At 0356, she reached the emergency access panel near the corridor junction. Security staff looked confused. What are you doing? She did not look at them. Her fingers moved once across the panel. Not random. Precise input sequence. A senior doctor stepped forward. Only security can override. The panel clicked. Authorization. Accepted. The system changed state multiple. Corridor locks reconfigured in sequence. Not opening. Rerouting. She had not unlocked the hospital. She had redistributed. Its security froze. You don't have clearance for that level, she interrupted softly. You do not have time for clearance. At that exact moment, the ER corridor door finally gave, metal snapped. Inward. First visible breach. Footsteps entered the upper corridor immediately after, controlled, not rushed, and at the same time, from the stairwell access. Point. Another set of footsteps resumed. Now both axes were active, converging. Inside Trauma Bay 2, the patient's eyes shifted toward the corridor again, then toward the nurse. A brief pause. Recognition. Not of identity, of structure, of intent alignment. Outside, the hospital had now fully entered collapse phase, but inside the intersection zone, something else had formed. Order under. Pressure, temporary, fragile, intentional. The nurse stood still at the control panel, hands lowered now, no longer adjusting, no longer observing, acting, only when required. And as footsteps approached from both corridors, she made a final quiet adjustment to the access routing system, not to stop the breach, but to redirect its path, because at this point, the goal was no longer defense, it was containment shaping, and she had just taken control of the geometry of the hospital. At 0358, the hospital no longer had separate threats. It had one moving system entering from multiple directions. Upper corridor stairwell junction, both converging toward the ER intersection, but something had changed in how they were moving. The pace was no longer exploratory, it was guided, because the hospital itself was now responding differently. Doors that should have been direct access were rerouted. Corridors that should have aligned were subtly broken into detours. The structure was still intact, but no longer predictable. Inside the ER wing, security forces regrouped near the fractured entrance. Weapons were visible now, but hesitation was stronger than readiness. We're losing structural control, one of them said into the radio. The reply came, delayed, distorted. Fall back to secondary containment. Point. But secondary containment no longer existed in a clean form. The nurse stood at the central intersection panel, still focused, not reacting to noise anymore, reacting to flow. A senior doctor behind her finally spoke with urgency. You've rerouted emergency pathways without authorization. If this fails, she cut him off quietly. It will not fail. Not confidence assessment. At 0401, the first hostile presence entered full ER visibility. Not rushing, scanning, weapon lowered but ready. Behind him, another figure appeared at the stairwell junction entrance. 2 points of pressure, one system. Security raised weapons, but did not fire. Not I. Yet too many civilians still in overlapping sightlines. The nurse did not move, but she shifted one final access parameter on the control panel, not locking, not opening, synchronizing. Delay response. At 0402, Trauma Bay 2 door opened. A doctor stepped out, confused. We have full consciousness in the patient, but he's requesting situational assessment. That sentence did not make sense to most staff. But the nurse turned her head slightly toward the room, and for the first time, the tactical patient stood slowly. Controlled movement, not weak, not unstable professional recovery posture under incomplete conditions. He stepped toward the threshold of the room, paused, looked through the glass corridor, then toward the converging entry points, and he said nothing, but his presence changed how the entering figures adjusted, a subtle recalibration. recognition. Without confirmation, at 0403, one of the external figures spoke into a comm. Device. Short phrase. Unclear to most. But the tactical patient reacted. Immediately, not visibly, but internally, a shift in posture. The nurse noticed it instantly, because it confirmed what she had already inferred. This was not random intrusion. It was retrieval protocol, inside a compromised civilian structure, and they were adjusting for contact recovery. At that moment, security inside the ER tensed. We may have hostage situation developing, someone whispered. But it wasn't hostage dynamics, it was identity extraction under containment breach. The nurse stepped away from the panel slowly, not disengaging, transitioning. Now, fully within operational alignment of the space she had shaped, she walked toward the glass corridor where all sightlines converged. No announcement, no warning, just presence. At 0405, the tactical patient stepped fully out of Trauma Bay 2. For the first time, both external groups saw him clearly. The entering figures paused, then lowered their posture slightly. A controlled acknowledgement, not spoken, performed. One of them raised a hand in a brief coded gesture. The tactical patient responded with a minimal, now that was enough. Security inside the ER finally realized, this isn't an assault, one of them said quietly. It's extraction. But extraction had already been partially disrupted, because the environment had been altered. The nurse stood between both converging forces now, not physically blocking, but structurally central. The access system she modified had changed timing, spacing, and entry synchronization. Nothing was direct anymore. Everything was delayed, controlled, and in that controlled delay, she had created space for recognition. One of the external figures finally looked toward her, paused, not in confusion. Recognition. But he did not speak, neither. Did she? Because this was not the moment for explanation. It was the moment for alignment completion. And in that silence, the hospital finally understood something it had not been designed to handle. It was no longer just a medical facility under breach. It was an active operational environment hosting multiple controlled systems, and the quiet nurse standing at its center was not reacting to the situation. She had been structuring it. At 0407, the pressure inside the hospital stopped increasing, not because the threat was gone, but because it had stabilized into recognition. Both entry groups, upper corridor and stairwell, were now fully inside controlled visual range of each other in the central intersection. No sudden movements, no escalation, only measured assessment. The nurse remained at the center corridor line, where her earlier rerouting of access pathways had created a controlled funnel instead of a chaotic intersection. It was no longer a hospital corridor, it was a structured contact zone. Security inside the ER lowered their weapons slightly, not fully, but enough to signal uncertainty rather than engagement. One officer spoke into his radio, voice low. "We are holding." "Situation is not active combat." The response came after a delay. "Confirm status," a pause, then, "Stand by." Inside Trauma Bay 2, the tactical patient stood fully upright now, no longer restrained by equipment or sedation influence. His posture was steady, professional, composed. He looked toward the external group on the stairwell side, then toward the upper corridor group. A brief exchange of coded gestures occurred between them. Minimal, efficient, no. Wasted motion. This was not negotiation, was confirmation of recovery conditions. The nurse watched without intervening. Her role here was no longer operational controlled, had shifted to structural maintenance, ensuring no collapse occurred during transition. A senior doctor approached her carefully. "What is happening here?" She answered without turning fully. "Recovery extraction under controlled breach conditions." He frowned. "You knew this would happen?" A pause, then, "I recognized the pattern." No further explanation followed. At 0410, one of the external figures stepped forward slightly. He did not aim his weapon. He did not signal threat. Instead, he spoke a single phrase into his comm device, the tactical patient responded with a short nod. That was the final confirmation. The engagement phase had ended. Not with force, but with acknowledgement. Security inside the ER slowly began to disengage posture, not fully relaxed, but no longer actively preparing for impact. The stairwell group repositioned slightly, forming a protective perimeter rather than entry. Pressure. The upper corridor group mirrored the same. Balance restored, not peace. Containment. Resolution. The nurse finally moved from the central line. Slow, measured, she walked toward the side corridor, where lighting was dimmer and staff movement was minimal. No one stopped her. No one called her, because no one fully understood what had just stabilized the situation. At 0414, internal systems began to return to normal. Configuration, access routes restored, emergency, locks reset, security protocols downgraded, from active breach to post-incident monitoring, but nothing felt normal because everyone who had been present understood something had changed in the structure of the hospital itself. A junior nurse whispered, "Who was she?" No one answered. Inside Trauma Bay 2, the tactical patient prepared for departure with the external team. Before leaving, he paused briefly at the corridor threshold. His gaze moved once across the intersection, then stopped, on the empty space where the nurse had stood moments earlier. He said nothing, but he gave a single, controlled nod, acknowledgement, not to authority, to contribution. Then he left. At 0417, the external group exited the hospital through controlled corridors, no alarms, no escalation, only monitored. Withdrawal. Security slowly reestablished full perimeter control, but the tone had changed permanently because now they understood. The hospital had not simply survived an intrusion, it had been temporarily restructured, under pressure, and held together by someone who never once announced herself, and when staff finally turned to look for her, she was no longer in the central ward. Only her empty station remained, clean, organized, as if nothing had happened. At 0422, the hospital returned to something that looked like normality, but it wasn't normal. It was reset behavior over fractured memory. Emergency lights were switched back to standard mode. Corridor doors unlocked in sequence. Security teams repositioned to standard patrol routes instead of breach containment points. The sounds of the ward slowly returned. Monitor beeps, distant footsteps, the soft roll of a stretcher. Yet everything felt quieter than before. Not peaceful, just emptied of urgency. In the ER wing, staff moved carefully, as if unsure which version of the night they were allowed to return to. A junior doctor stood near the intersection corridor, staring at the empty space where the central control panel had been used. "It feels like nothing happened," he said quietly. No one responded, because everyone knew that wasn't true. Something had happened. It just wasn't visible in the way hospitals usually recorded events. A senior nurse reviewed incident logs at the station. Her expression tightened slightly. Access reroutes, temporary override sequences. None of this matches standard authorization. The security officer beside her nodded slowly. "We'll need a full internal report." But even as they spoke, there was uncertainty in their tone, because reports describe systems, and this had not felt like a system event. At 0431, external police and special response units completed perimeter confirmation. No active threat remained inside the building. Official classification contained breach incident. But inside the hospital, no one used that phrase confidently because it didn't explain the part they could not document properly. The part where the structure itself seemed to anticipate movement. The part where timing felt controlled, rather than random. And the part where one person had moved through all of it without raising her voice. Once in Trauma Bay 2, the room was already being reset, beds adjusted, equipment replaced, records updated, as if preparing for the next patient. As if the night had been just another statistical anomaly, a nurse folded a used glove, slowly, and placed it in disposal, then hesitated. "Where did she go?" she asked. No one answered immediately, because no one had seen her leave. There was no recorded exit from the ER wing during the final containment phase, only absence. At 0438, a security camera review began. Footage showed corridor movement, breach entry points, patient transfer sequences, and external response coordination. Everything was documented, except key transitions. At multiple points, the central intersection frame showed brief obstruction, just long enough to interrupt visual continuity of one individual. Not lost, not missing, just untrackable in sequence. The technician frowned. These are clean gaps. Not camera failure, more like timing interference. The supervisor looked at the screen longer than necessary, then said quietly, "She moved through all of it without registering properly." No one corrected him, because it matched what they remembered. At 05 Lie, sunrise had not yet reached the hospital windows. But the emergency ward had already returned to routine. Flow. New patients arriving, old shifts ending, reports being filed, but the atmosphere was different now. Quieter, more careful, like a system that had briefly experienced something beyond its normal operating. Assumptions. Near the supply counter, a folded duty sheet was placed neatly where it always had been, her station clean, organized, undisturbed. Junior nurse walked past it and stopped briefly. She didn't even say anything after all that, she murmured. A pause. Then she added, "It's like she was never trying to be seen in the first place." At 05:12, the hospital administration marked the incident as resolved. No public statement was made about internal operational anomalies. No mention of structural, rerouting behavior. No reference to coordinated, external response alignment. Just a standard classification, entry. But inside the hospital, those who were present understood something simple. The night had not been survived because of systems. It had been held together by awareness that never asked for attention, and in the final frame of security review footage just before full system reset, there was a brief, unremarkable shot. A nurse walking down a side corridor, unhurried, hands relaxed, disappearing into normal morning. Light, no spotlight, no recognition, only silence returning to its place, and the hospital, now fully restored on paper, carried something it could not record. The memory that, for a few hours, control had not belonged to protocol, but to someone who never needed to announce it.